God? In other words, is he credible? Is he really looking out for you? Is he God? You know, can he do what he said? Do you trust God? Are you fully convinced of these facts, that he's credible, that he's got your best interest at heart, and that he is the ruler of the heavens and the earth? And then will you, and that's a matter of a commitment, are you committed to actually trusting God? And all of those questions ultimately lead to um, the fact that God needs us to trust Him. And then, if we want to be usable in His hands, then we have to come to this place so that it's not just about us in these episodic kind of exchanges with God, but there is a deliberate, intentional trusting Him so that we can be available, so that when He needs somebody to go, like Isaiah, he said, I'll go, right? Will you go? Well, if you're going to go on a journey of doing and acting on behalf of God in the earth, if you're going to walk out the purposes of God, it means you have to trust God, and you have to fully trust God. But there's a commitment that has to be made to that. It's not something that's passive. You don't get that level of trust just by attending church services or just by even reading your Bible. But this is a real, very real dynamic trust that we must commit to. And that puts us in a position to where when God needs a vessel, when he needs somebody to be his hands, his feet, his eyes, his ears, you can be that individual. That's my own heart. It's always been my heart for as far as I can remember. And when I was introduced to the Lord, I wanted to be available to him. Didn't always do the best with that. Had to grow into it. Had to grow into trusting God and learning how to do that in a consistent way. And again, not just in an episodic way. Um, but trust is a choice. It is a choice. But I want to talk about, I guess you could consider the next level from trust then to dependence. Trust is something that you choose to do. Dependence is something that you develop over time. And so I looked at a conversation that God had with Moses, and Moses had with the Lord, and I thought to just kind of look into this conversation and then develop that into talking about dependence on God. So Exodus chapter 33, verses 12 through 15. It's a familiar story. We understand that Moses is or has led the children of Israel out of Egypt, and they're in the process of pursuing the promised land. So that's a heavy responsibility on Moses. You don't do anything of this magnitude without having, number one, trust in God and being committed to that, or independence in God. You have to have both to do this kind of thing that God has given Moses to do. So here it says, then Moses said to the Lord. Now listen to this conversation. Now we're going to slow walk it a bit, just going to kind of develop it, and then leave you with something to ponder and something to hang on to in the development of your faith. Then Moses said to the Lord, see, you say to me, bring up this people, but you've not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found grace in my sight. Now, therefore, I pray, if I found grace in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you, and that I may find grace in your sight. And consider that this nation is your people. And he said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Now, this verse 15 is one we hear quoted often. This rings in my ear too, periodically. But it is a emphatic statement of dependence on God, an emphatic statement of dependence on God. Verse 15, then he said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not bring us up from here. My goodness, my goodness. Moses is um, aware of the fact that he needs to be led by God. There's some things that come out of this text that I want to develop today that I believe will be a blessing to help you to move into that space also of dependence. You need God. I need God. I know I need God. And as I kind of developed last week, you know, when you're following God and you're trusting God and particularly as it relates to his purposes, and keep that primary in your thinking. God gonna take care of you. God will take care of you. God has taken care of you. You have the record. You have the history. You have the memories of God, even seeing you through very difficult times, very challenging times. And much of what God has done in our lives in the past, as we reflect, we will recognize that it wasn't always that you prayed about it that God answered the prayer. God is being the Father that He is, sees and knows. In fact, there's in the Gospels when it speaks of prayer, it talks about the fact Jesus said He knows what you need. That's not the issue. God knows what you need, but He's such a good God that He's always looking out for you and taking care of you and making a way out of no way for you. All of that is very, very true. But here the focus I want to bring you back to again and again and again is the mission and the purposes of God and what he is up to right now. What is he up to in the heavens and what is he up to in the earth? And what does my life have to do with that? Because as I said before, if we're going to walk in this place of dependence upon the Lord and trust him by choice, that puts us in a place where God can use us. So here, Moses is having this conversation, and the conversation basically, when you talk about a conversation, you're talking about prayer. But we see the exchange, and I was thinking how wonderful it is to be able to have this conversation in print, have it so that we can see and see how Moses related to God and how God related to his servant and the conversation that they will have. Not just Moses, but others. Of course, David is one of the key players that said things out loud and was very expressive. And we get a chance to see those relationships. And we can go on down the line because many of them did. But the first thing I noticed is that Moses immediately references the mission in this conversation. You know, he said, Moses said to the Lord, see, you have said to me, bring up this people. First thing is, what is God looking for me to do? What has he said that I should do? And we talked about that in our prayer list. We talked about it last week. What is my responsibility in the kingdom of God? What's my role? Do I know? If you don't know, then you need to ask. Now, if you don't have a specific, because everybody wants to know, well, what's my purpose? The first purpose is to obey what you know. Obey what you already know. Obey what is clear. That's the basic, fundamental first step to being in a place where God can use you, obeying what you know. But Moses has a specific assignment. He is leading these people into the promised land, and they'll make it to the promised land because it's a promise, right? And so he's talking to the Lord, and he references the mission, and then you see here this dependent trust in the Lord. But you have not let me know whom you will send with me. So now he wants to know specifically, who's gonna go, right? Then he goes on, he says, now who's gonna go? Where do you want us to go? And what time do you want us to go? Now, to me, I saw this as Moses's refusal to trust in his own calculations. Do you know how easy it is to start to trust in your own calculations, to try to make sense of something without considering God's voice? It's easy because it's easy. You don't have to stop. You don't have to take the time. You don't have to consider course correction. We hate course correction. We just want to get it done. It reminds me of writing. If you're going to write a book, you write a chapter. The worst part of it is having to rewrite the chapter and then rewrite again. Nobody wants the course correction. We want the easy way. Now they're saying you just pop it into AI and let AI clean it up and fix it, and you're good to go. And they're warning us already. I had to send some warning to some people working. I said, now be careful with the AI. I can tell when it's the computer doing the writing. Yeah. But we don't want that. But I liked the fact that Moses, this brother, he was sensitive enough and dependent on God to know that he needed to know every step of the way. He said, okay, this is what you call me to do. Here's the mission, right? He said, but I need you to be clear, Lord. I need to know who's going with me, who's riding with me, who is dependable and who is not, right? Who you've identified, because it's nothing like the Lord identifying people that will work with you to achieve his purposes. I look around and I'm grateful, and you hear me say it from time to time that there's no mistake that you're here today. There's no mistake that you're here in this season, here in this moment. And then I have those of you who have been here for decades working on number 3. God does that. God does that. And the thing about God bringing a people together to do a job, to do his bidding, is that he equips us and puts in our hearts a certain disposition. It's like you refuse to be moved. You refuse to be shaken. You refuse to be rattled. But God gives the grace, the ability to stand through season after season, and you want and need those kind of folk if you're going to go do something from God. And Moses, in his experiences, clearly had some folk around that may not have been on the same page. And it's nothing like dragging people along who are not on the same page trying to do something for God, because they're distracted, because they can't see, because they're not having this level of conversation with God. They don't have the capacity to be fully dependent upon God. So they're looking around. Moses had folk to look around. I think at one occasion they asked Moses, who did he think he was? Even close family members, because he's being led of the Lord, but they're being led by their emotions, and they're not dependent on God. They're dependent on what their eyes see. They're dependent on their emotions. They're dependent on all of the other ancillary things. But we need to grow like Moses into a place of depending upon God, to have a dependence that's rock solid. So Moses, he references the mission. Then he goes into, who are you going to send? And he said, then you said, you know my name, and I found grace in your sight. Now, therefore, I pray. I have found grace in your sight. Show me now your way, that I may know you and that I may find grace in your sight. He just continues to build on that. And then he says, consider that this is your people. This nation is your people. Now, see, that's tapping. That's really being unfair to God. But he's bringing them back around, right? He's bringing them back around. He's seeking confirmation from the Lord to move forward. But in that, he's reminding him and connecting to God's heart. Lord, I'm doing this not for me. I'm not doing this for fame or fortune. I'm doing this because this is your people, and I need your presence to go with me if I'm going to achieve what you call me to do. That's dependence. I can't go without God. Now, we say these things, we express them, but how many of us really depend on God? Because depending on God has a certain look and a certain feel to it. Tomorrow just made mention of the fact that it's not about doing all that you can, and then finally God becomes your last go-to. In fact, I talked to Darren Myers this week, and he was saying that they had similar conversations, that we have to grow up and become people who depend on God on this level, so that your first go-to, your first course of action is to go to God and say, God, you've called me to do some things. I need to know who should be riding with me, Huh? I need to know where we need to be going. I need to know when we should be going because God's timing is so vital and so important. And my Lord, Lord, help us with our inability to wait, our impatience, moving out when God is saying, just slow down and just wait for me. Moses had this down to a science. But even that, the other thing that I noticed in verse 13, he said, if I have found grace in your sight, show me now your way. Now, there's a knowing in my heart, and I'm hoping the same for you. There's a knowing in my heart. And people ask me every now and then, they say, I just don't know. How do you do this? And I say it, and it's not a cliche. I say readily, it's the grace. Period. It's not the grace plus something. It's not the grace plus my know-how. It's not the grace plus my experience. It's not the grace plus anything. It is the grace of God. And what I saw in this exchange between Moses and the Lord is Moses basically said, okay, yeah, it's grace, and grace is a real thing, and grace enables. But even moreover, what I saw here was him coming back to say, I'm going to need some specific grace for this specific task, for this movement. And so you're coming back to God and you're returning to him and you're reminding him, here's what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. But I cannot do this without grace. What is grace? Divine enablement. It's the ability to achieve things for the purpose of God that you cannot do with your limited resources, that you cannot do with your finite knowledge, that you cannot do in your own strength and energy. You need the grace of God, and the grace of God will enable you to do things that will blow your mind. Anybody that's followed God, anybody that's ever had a vision from the Lord to achieve anything will tell you that it is overwhelming, that there are times of fear involved in the process, and that it is bigger than anything you can imagine. You can't calculate it. You can't do the math. You don't understand how it's going to be done from a time standpoint. You rarely have the resources that you need to get it done. But by God's grace, you can achieve incredible things. So this is Moses coming back because he lives in this space called dependence. And he knows that the only way to have success in God, the only way to move God's program forward is that you do so by his grace. And so here this conversation again, which is prayer, this exchange says to us, enunciates the fact that brother Moses had a dependence upon God, a dependence. So he needed the grace. He said, I need grace for this new movement, for this next phase. I need grace. And it's like you can, after so long of doing something, you can depend on what you've developed from a gifting standpoint. You can depend on your experience. I've done this enough time. I can do this in my sleep. Yeah. You can depend on your know-how. There's it's funny, people who become experts in things, they just do it, and it's just so flawless and so with ease they do things. You've probably heard either seen some memes or heard people talk about, folk asking, well, why do you charge so much? It only took you 5 minutes to do that, and you charged all that money. He said, yeah, but it took years for me to develop the knowledge and the know-how to be able to do that. And you're paying into that, right? But when we depend on God, none of that matters. Doesn't matter how long I've been doing it. Don't matter how much I know. Doesn't matter how much experience I have. I need to depend on God for every step of the way. Every step of the way, I need to know who to bring. Every step of the way, I need to know which direction to go in. Every step of the way, I need to know God's timing. I need his grace to be able to move out. Dependence. Dependence. God calls us to do stuff individually and collectively. We need to be in touch with that. We need to be having conversations like this with the Lord. Lord, what do you want me to do? Hmm? So let's just talk about this dependence. Number one, dependence is born out of relationship. It's born out of relationship. This isn't a one-off. This isn't, oh my God, I'm in the middle of the desert with all of these people, and maybe I should talk to God. It's not like Moses was going along and found a way to creatively open the Red Sea and bring these people across, and then ran into a situation and decided to talk to God. No, this is a relationship that began way before they began to even think to move out of Egypt. So dependence is born out of relationship. This is a thing that is developed over time. It's a series of conversations. It's a series of exchanges and experiences. It is watching God be God time and time again. It's that experience, that exposure that brings it to a place where it say, wait a minute, I can trust him. I do trust him. But in trusting him and getting to that place of trust, now I have grown to a place of dependence where I can't do it without you, and I refuse to try to do it without you. I try to convey this to my children by the way I live. Every time they need something, I don't put it in their face, but I'm sure they have to look and say, well, he's living a certain way that I might need to consider, because he ain't never without, even when he's without. And kids don't believe you're ever broke. If you're broke, you can tell your kids you're broke. The kids don't believe you're broke. They're not convinced. And they're not convinced because they've seen you deliver, because God delivered for you. I'm preaching real good this morning. It's born out of relationship. All right. In fact, I kind of coined this one, that trust, dependence is trust that has become full grown. It's an adult now. You know about adulting? That's dependence. Okay. So it starts with steps of faith. Starts with steps of faith. Small steps, like anything else. You grow, you develop, you trust God here, and boom, you see him come through. You trust him over here, boom. And now you got a pattern. Now you got experience. Now you got history. Now there is that knowing, and we still, until we get up on our feet and grow into a place of dependence, we still kind of vacillate back and forth. When times are tough, we know how to talk to them. We'll have these conversations when times are tough. When times are easy, not so much, right? Because we start to lean back on our experience, our know-how, our own abilities. But there's always, God sprinkles experiences throughout our life where we have to come to him because we don't have the resources, the tools, the people that were once there are not there anymore. And if they are there, they don't have what they had before. So now we don't know which way to turn. We got to go back to God. Well, listen, how about we develop this dependence upon God so that we're not doing that? We're not riding a roller coaster. We're not having these emotional shifts and this erratic kind of thing going on in our lives, in our walk. Be like Moses. Grow in your dependence, step by step, faith by faith. Dependence will produce confidence, will produce peace, and will produce courage. I'm slowing that one down. Dependence will produce confidence, peace, and courage. And confidence, there's just the knowing. You've heard me say it before. There is the knowing. God is, God will, God does. There's the knowing, that confidence. And then that peace. And the peace, I've been examining this lately because every now and then, you feel that turbulence. Those of you who are flyers in the plane and everything's real smooth and you're sitting back just chilling, anticipating a smooth landing, and all of a sudden you hit that turbulence. And even if you've been traveling for years, you still have that thought of, ooh. But then there's that peace in knowing, right? You're able to get past that. That kind of happens to us spiritually, where there's a rumble that shakes us for a moment, but then all of a sudden we begin to reflect on the relationship with God, and we reflect on how God has always come through. And even when it didn't unfold in the way that we would have desired. We had a particular prayer, but God didn't decide to go that way. he answered in another way. Even in that, we've seen him then come behind that and sweeten it up and let us know that when we're walking in him, it is well. When we walk in him, he does cause all things to work together for good. He's able to do that. So the dependence that we develop, it grows from the confidence to the peace, and then the courage. And that's the courage to do what he's called you to do, the courage to do what he's given you direction to do. You're able to stand up in the face of opposition. You're able to stand up in the face of challenges and seemingly defeat, and be able to achieve success in God, because there is dependence. There is a dependence on God, who is God. There is a dependence on that grace that has been provided for that season. And you know that at the end of the day, God wins, and as a consequence, you win. And that kind of dependence becomes a norm after a while, after walking with God. But you still have to feed it now. You got to feed it with those conversations. You have to come back and you have to remind God of what he said. You have to remind God of what you committed to. You have to point back to the mission, point back to what's most important. You know, when you start to make God priority, when that Matthew 6:33 kicks in, seek first the kingdom and all of his righteousness. In other words, make God's purposes priority. When you do that, you can bring that back to God. Say, God, I'm doing this. I'm not just doing this because I need you to pay my bills. I'm not a part of this ministry or doing this work just because I need to have ease in my relationships, to be able to gain favor in the workplace, to be healthy with no issues in that area. We have to remind God, I'm not here for that. I'm not here for the fish and the loaves. I'm here because there's something that you're wanting to achieve in the earth. The mandate is that I should know you and that I should make you known. I'm on that, Lord. That's what I'm on. I'm on that page. And so I press into that and I come back to you asking for new grace to be able to make this next level of movement and the courage to be able to do so, because I know, because I'm dependent on you, I can stand up in the face of it. It will become my norm to trust you, depend on you. I'll live that day by day, because I know that this is important to you. This isn't a new mission. This isn't a new mission. But here you've invited me to be a part. And so I'm going to walk in it. So dependent people, just a couple few points. Dependent people trust that God is in full control. They have practiced letting go of the wheel and allowing God to drive alone. They stay in touch with headquarters. That's that conversation. And their lives are tied to the bigger program. That's people who are dependent on God. Amen.